What is your aspiration as a designer?
Yeah, I personally like mechanical engineering and combining this with good-looking design.
Yeah, so I think my inspiration for designing is basically bringing in new perspectives.
What I think I want to do is make it easier for people to live a sustainable life.
That's good.
Yeah.
Every designer has their own values and norms. Bearing in mind these different backgrounds can lead to different types of problem framing.
Problem framing, we use it a lot, don't we?
So what problem framing means to me, I think, is very consciously taking in, looking at a problem or a topic from like different perspectives, and kind of trying to step out of the more default ways that you would look at it, and find different ways to not only understand the problem better, but also kind of see where you could bring it from there.
I would say also taking into account the interpretation of the client on its own, what they state as their question, if that actually is the way to go. So I would think I would make a step back and look at what do they actually want, and can I reframe it in a way that I can suit it to my style as well before going forward.
For me, it feels like I'm born with it. We use it every time. For each question that we get, for each project that we are working on, we always start with problem framing. So it's always the starting point.
One goal of problem framing is to define the situation. And this situation is often considered a paradox because you actually don't know the how or the outcome, the goal you initially want to achieve. So in that case, since these two are unknown, at which one do you start? The goal of problem framing is to get this designer's vision straight on the how and the outcome.
Okay, so what is my goal when I define a problem frame?
Filter out the noise and, yeah, as I said, I think to find a focus.
I think making your project more understandable, and it's kind of something where you know you're heading. It's kind of already setting somewhat of a requirement.
I think the most important step at first when you get a design brief that you aim to understand it, right? You have to, you can draw it, you can like take it all apart and divide it up in different factors, and then you have to make sure that you understand what they ask you for.
I think we as designers, we are taught how to look as broad as possible. But when you frame a problem or when you frame a project, you just kind of define how far you are going to go.
For me, it's mostly, I think, inspiration, but it also helps in defining some of the rules I need to apply for, and it's also about kind of triggering the client as well into thinking like maybe we can tackle this problem in a different way.
Another goal of problem framing is that it should create new perspective on existing problems. So basically your client comes over to you with the how and the outcome, which are given therefore. But nonetheless, the designer will try to reformulate these to create new perspectives. Do you have an example of a time, a project for instance, where you framed or reframed a problem and were pretty content about the outcome?
When I was framing in this project, I got to know my user better and the problems that the user had. So certainly I kind of knew better where I wanted to go, because first, you have kind of a fake direction in which you want to go, but in the end it turns out more to be something concrete that you can design for.
I looked into how to actually transport the flower bouquets instead of just making a package, because I kind of felt that having to design a package every time and then throw it away is the unsustainable solution, and I actually wanted the way to transport it to be the sustainability factor in it, so you could reuse the way it's transported every time instead of having to throw away a package.
Lastly, the goal of problem framing is communication. This is considered a crucial value for designers. As we later in life, most designers have to mediate between people working in marketing or the real engineers. And to understand these different perspectives, communication is a great tool.
Problem framing in the field of design is handled differently by different people. A client might hand you over a design brief, which might be full of assumptions, and you can take that out by reframing the problem. This way, you can get new perspectives towards the problem and find a solution that's more suitable.
In which part of the design process do you use problem framing?
Mostly at the beginning of a project, but it's important to, I think, look back to it.
I think it's mostly the starting point for each project, but of course you use it also during the whole project, also at the end or in the middle, if you're stuck or if you... I think it's always good to have the problem inside, but yeah, it's always the starting point.
Probably the early stage the most, because at some point I'm kind of starting to rambling on with I just need to finish it. I'm not really looking at the framing anymore, because it also can go into a completely different way, and I don't want to be held back by it at that point. So that's where I kind of lose the problem framing statement.
Problem framing is a process which takes place through the entire design process, because every little design problem needs its own solution and its own problem frame.
I think I usually realize that I've switched to like a new kind of problem frame is when all of a sudden there are a lot more questions that are sprouting up.
When you suddenly realize like, ooh, I did it wrong, or this is not the way I wanted, this was not the smart way to frame the problem, it can really stir up the process.
Sometimes from my own vision I completely see a new way to actually go about it, and sometimes I just have to really read into the subject at first, and then maybe at some point there's an aha moment where I actually think this is the way to go.
So there are different ways to tackle problem framing. The first one is, for instance, through metaphors or analogies. And this can help the designer to get a different perspective on the problem. Another way could be through more in-depth research, which helps creating more understanding about the problem. Or you could use a different way of thinking. For instance, thinking about worst-case scenarios. So these are some of the methods that designers can choose to tackle problem framing. But of course, there are way more methods to do this.
How do you tackle problem framing? Do you use a method?
Yeah, I don't know if I really use methods consciously.
Actually, not really a strict method, I guess, because I don't really know a framing method if I think by heart, but I guess there is kind of like a manner that I do it in. I kind of, yes, look at the user, you look at the problem and maybe a bit about the context and create a frame around that.
I think the way I tackle problem framing is it's not very structured actually. I like to think of it as, usually in the beginning, like during the exploration phase, I try to kind of very consciously take in these different positions and tell like little stories kind of. It's a very fluid process of just coming up with stories and then bouncing those off of my group mates if I have them.
What we always do is a lot of analyzing and already starting with idea generations and then around that problem. And I'm not sure if we always use like one method for it.
So what we see now is that designers don't really use problem framing very methodically, but this could lead to more efficient work and better results. What we do see is that designers use problem framing very automatically and very intuitively instead of using methods. But our question is this really a good thing?
How I would describe problem framing in a word is...
I think the first thing that came into mind was shifting.
of direction, maybe.
Rethink.
Essential.
Perspective, I think.